Hello, and welcome. Settle in wherever you are tonight. Let your shoulders drop. Dim the lights if you can. Pull a blanket close, and let your body know that nothing more is asked of it right now except to rest and listen. This is a quiet place, a slow place, a place where nothing needs to happen quickly and nothing needs to be remembered for later. Before we begin, I want to ask you two small things. The way an old friend might ask before settling into a long story by the fire. Where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere cold? Somewhere warm? Somewhere far from home? And what time is it for you right now, as this house we are about to enter slowly comes into focus around you? There is no need to answer aloud. Just notice it. Let it ground you here in this moment, before we drift into another one. If these slow journeys into ordinary life feel like something your evenings have been missing, you are welcome to subscribe. We do not ask for much, but this little channel grows only through people like you choosing to stay a while, and it means more than you know. And if you feel like it, leave a small comment telling us where you are tonight. It helps us feel less like we are speaking into an empty room and more like we are gathered together, the way people used to gather in kitchens like the one you are about to enter. Now, let the room around you fall away. It is late in the afternoon, in a small Canadian town. Sometime in the 1950s, the light outside has turned that particular shade of blue-grey that only happens in the hour before supper when the sun has given up its warmth, but not yet its glow. Snow sits along the edges of the driveway in packed, greying ridges, pushed there days ago by a shovel, and hardened since by cold nights and passing boots. Somewhere down the street, a screen door slaps shut. A dog barks twice and stops. You are standing in the back porch of a small house, unbuckling your boots, and the cold clings to your wool coat even after you have stepped inside. Your breath still hangs faintly visible in the unheated porch air. Ahead of you, past the porch door, is the kitchen. And even before you open that door, you already know what is waiting on the other side. You can smell it. Onions softening in a pan. The particular mineral warmth of a potato pot at a low boil. Something with flour, browning slowly. Underneath it, faint but constant, the smell of the wood and coal stove that has been running most of the day, filling the room with a dry, contained heat that no radiator quite matches. You push open the door, and the warmth meets you like a hand on your chest. The kitchen holds you the way it always does. It is not large. It does not need to be. Everything in it has been placed with purpose, not decoration. A stove against one wall, a sink beneath the window, a rectangular wooden table in the middle of the floor, with 4, sometimes 5, mismatched chairs pulled close around it. The window above the sink has a thin lace curtain, and through it you can see the last of the daylight fading behind the neighbour's clothesline. Empty now, the wooden pins still clipped along its length, waiting for tomorrow's wash. Your mother is at the stove, her back to you, one hand resting on her hip in that particular posture. Women of this house always seem to fall into while waiting for something to finish cooking. She does not turn around fully. She says your name, half a question, half a fact, checking that you are home, that the day has closed the way it is supposed to. You answer. She nods, without looking, satisfied, and returns her attention to the pot. You hang your coat on the hook by the door. The same hook it has always gone on, worn smooth at the edges from years of coats sliding onto it, and you step further into the room, drawn, as always, toward the table. It sits there the way it always sits there, waiting, steady. The wood is a deep amber brown, scarred faintly in places from years of hot pots set down too quickly. Knife nicks along one edge where someone once cut bread directly on the surface and was scolded for it. There is a permanence to this table that nothing else in the house quite matches. Chairs get replaced. Curtains get changed with the seasons, but the table stays. It has always stayed. You will come to understand, though you do not think of it in these words yet, that this table is not simply furniture. It is where the day gets sorted, where arguments get quietly settled, and where things too painful to say out loud somehow still manage to get said in glances, in the way a hand rests briefly on another hand while reaching for the salt. It is where money gets stretched thin without a single word about money ever being spoken. It is where a family, without quite realizing it, teaches itself who it is. But that understanding is still ahead of you tonight. Right now, you are only cold and hungry and glad to be inside. Your mother tells you to wash up. You do, the water from the kitchen tap running cold at first, then lukewarm, never quite hot the way it will be one day, decades from now, in a kitchen you cannot yet imagine. You dry your hands on the towel hanging from the oven door handle, worn thin in the middle from years of hands just like yours. And as you turn back toward the table waiting there in the low amber light of the single overhead bulb, you understand, quietly, wordlessly, the way children understand things before they have language for them, that you are about to sit down at the center of everything that matters in this house. There is a particular quality to this exact minute. The boots finally off the coat, finely hung. The cold of the porch still clinging faintly to the backs of your knees, while the front of you has already begun to warm. That you will spend the rest of your life trying without much success to fully recreate. It is not simply the temperature of the room, it is the sum of everything the room contains. The low burr of your mother's voice half hummed along to whatever is playing on the radio by the window. The particular clink of a wooden spoon against the rim of a pot. The sight through the steam rising off the stove of a kitchen that has not changed its shape in years, and, for as long as you can help it, never will. You notice the way you notice such things only at the very beginning of an evening before the evening itself has worn the noticing away. The small details that make this kitchen unmistakably itself and no other kitchen on the street. The particular yellowing of the lace curtain, softened by years of steam, the exact place on the wall where the calendar hangs a half-inch crooked no matter how many times someone straightens it. The chair at the table with the slightly shorter back leg, propped now with a folded matchbook that has been there so long no one remembers who first wedged it into place. This is where our story begins tonight. Not with a war, not with a headline, not with anything the history books would think to record. Just a table, a kitchen, a family gathering, the way families gathered every single evening of every single ordinary day in houses just like this one, all across this country for decades that have now quietly slipped into the past. Stay with me a while longer. Let's sit down. Notice too the particular hush that has settled over the street outside while you were still unbuckling your boots in the porch. Supper time in a town like this one arrives almost in unison house by house, the way dusk itself arrives. Not on anyone's clock exactly, but on some older, shared instinct that every household on the block seems to obey without ever comparing notes. Somewhere, 2 doors down, a window glows amber the same way yours does. A little further, a woman calls a child's name twice before it is answered. The sound carrying thin and clear through the cold air. You are not the only kitchen filling with steam and low voices at this exact hour. You are simply the one you happen to be standing in tonight. And there is a strange quiet comfort in knowing that whatever is happening around your own table is happening in its own particular shape at a dozen other tables within earshot, all of them lit by the same falling light. There is a version of this evening that repeats itself with only the smallest variations for years before you are old enough to notice the repetition at all. The particular slant of the porch light, the particular weight of the door as it swings shut behind you. Heavier in winter when the cold has stiffened its hinge, the particular 2 or 3 seconds of silence just after you step inside, before your mother speaks, when the kitchen simply holds you, unhurried, asking nothing of you yet. It is only much later, long after this table and this kitchen have become memory rather than daily fact, that you will understand how much of what you now call childhood was built from exactly this, not the singular, remarkable evenings, but the thousands of nearly identical ones stacked so closely together that they eventually form something as solid and dependable as the table itself. Even the cold has its own particular character here, one you will come to miss in ways you cannot yet imagine decades from now in warmer, more efficient houses that never quite ask anything of you the way this one does. It is a cold with edges, a cold you have to actively outmaneuver. Layering, timing your dash from bed to stove, learning exactly which floorboards hold the night's chill longest. There is a kind of intimacy in this daily negotiation with the weather that later houses sealed and even tempered will never offer you again. And though you do not know it yet, some small part of you will spend years afterward faintly missing the particular discipline of a cold morning met head-on. The kitchen you have just entered was built, like most kitchens of its kind, around one central fact: heat had to be earned, and once earned, it had to be used for everything. The stove against the far wall is not the sleek white enamel range you might picture if your mind reaches first for later decades. In many homes of this era, particularly outside the largest cities, it is still part wood, part coal, sometimes with a small electric hot plate bolted on as a concession to modern convenience, used only for the smallest tasks, warming milk, melting butter, while the real cooking, the serious cooking, happens over the slower, deeper heat of the firebox. You know this stove the way you know your own hands. You know which lid lifts, with the little hooked key hanging on its nail beside the flue. You know that the front left burner runs hottest, because that is where the firebox sits directly beneath, and that anything delicate, a white sauce or custard, has to go toward the back, or it will catch and scorch before your mother can turn around twice. You know the particular clank of the ash pan being pulled out each morning, the small grey cloud that rises from it, no matter how carefully it is handled, dusting the toe of whoever stands too close. The heat from this stove does not stay contained to itself. It moves through the whole kitchen, and on the coldest days through the whole house, which is precisely why the kitchen becomes, without anyone deciding it should, the room where everyone ends up. In the front parlour, reserved for Sundays and for company, the air stays crisp and a little unfriendly. The good furniture sitting under a kind of hush, waiting for occasions that come rarely. But here, in the kitchen, the air is alive. It moves. It smells like something. It holds you the way the parlour never could. Beneath the window, the sink is deep and white, chipped faintly at one corner where a cast iron pot was set down too hard. One distracted evening, years ago, the story of exactly which evening, long since forgotten, though the chip itself remains a small permanent scar in the porcelain that nobody notices anymore because it has simply always been there. There is no automatic dishwasher humming beneath the counter. There is barely a counter at all by latest standards. Just a narrow strip of worn wooden surface on either side of the sink. Enough room for a dish rack and not much else. Washing dishes here is not a task you delegate to a machine. It is a task you delegate to hands, usually young hands, usually yours, standing on a small wooden stool pulled over from the pantry so you can reach the taps. Against the opposite wall, where a refrigerator might stand today, humming its quiet electric hum, there is instead, in the earliest years of this decade, in homes that have not yet made the leap, an icebox, a wooden cabinet lined with tin, cooled by a great block of ice, delivered on a regular schedule, by a man in a leather apron who carries it in with iron tongs, sliding it into the upper compartment where it will slowly, steadily melt over the coming days, dripping down into a pan beneath that must be emptied before it overflows onto the linoleum. You have forgotten that pan more than once. You remember the sharp, cold shock of stepping into a puddle in your sock feet, and the particular tone of your mother's voice when she discovered it before you did. But changes come to this room as the decade moves forward, and by its middle years in many houses like this one, the icebox has been replaced by something new. A real electric refrigerator, rounded at the corners, humming faintly in the corner of the kitchen with a self-satisfied electrical purr that nobody in the house quite gets used to at first. It becomes, for a while, something almost like a small celebrity in the household. Neighbours are invited in specifically to see it. Your mother opens the door for them with something close to ceremony, gesturing toward the little shelves, the tray for ice cubes that no longer needs to be delivered by a man with tongs. And there is a particular pride in her voice, a pride you will hear again and again throughout your childhood, attached to different objects, different rooms, different small proofs that this family too is moving forward with the times, is not being left behind. This is something you will learn slowly without ever being told directly, that the kitchen is not simply where food is made. It is where the family's progress is measured, quietly, object by object, against the progress of every other family on the street. A new refrigerator is not only a refrigerator, it is a statement made without a single word being spoken, understood perfectly by every neighbor who steps through that door. The floor beneath your feet deserves its own attention, because you will spend more hours of your childhood standing on this particular stretch of linoleum than on almost any other surface in your life. It is patterned. Small diamonds or sometimes squares in colors that seemed bright and modern in the store catalog and now a few years into daily use have dulled in a path worn between the stove, the sink, and the table, the exact triangle your mother walks 100 times a day, without ever seeming to notice she is walking it at all. In winter, this floor turns bitterly cold beneath sock feet, no matter how close the stove burns, and you learn to keep your slippers by the porch door. Learn the particular relief of sliding your feet into them the moment you cross the threshold. The walls hold their own quiet evidence of the life lived within them. A calendar from the local hardware store or the feed and grain company, its pages marked in pencil with appointments, birthdays, the dates when bills are due, hangs beside the door. A row of hooks holds aprons, a fly swatter in summer, a spare set of mittens drying from the previous outing. There is somewhere on the wall or propped on a shelf a small radio. Not yet a television in most homes at the decade's start, though that too will arrive before the decade closes, changing the shape of evenings in this house forever. For now, the radio provides the soundtrack to supper preparation. A woman's voice reading out a recipe, a program of music sometimes in the background of your mother's work. The low murmur of news you are not really listening to but that lodges itself somewhere in your memory anyway. The particular cadence of an announcer's voice becoming decades later, a sound that will bring this whole kitchen rushing back to you in an instant. Everything in this room is used. Nothing sits purely for decoration because nothing can afford to. The jar of buttons on the windowsill is not an ornament. It is a resource saved from worn-out shirts, ready to be sewn onto whichever garment loses one next. A tin of odd nails and screws beside the door is not clutter. It is insurance against a future repair nobody wants to pay a hardware store to make. The room is dense with use, dense with purpose, and it is precisely this density, this sense that every object has earned its place through function rather than fashion, that gives the kitchen its particular gravity, the feeling that this, more than any other room in the house, is where life is actually being lived. And in the center of it all, unmoving, patient, sits the table. There is a pantry too, tucked into a shallow closet off the kitchen's far corner. Its shelves lined with the particular geometry of a household that plans its meals a week or a season in advance, rather than a single afternoon at a time. Flour in a tin large enough to hold a family's worth of baking. Sugar in another, guarded a little more carefully. Rows of jars from last summer's canning, their labels written in your mother's careful hand, dates and contents, recorded with the precision of a woman who has learned through hard experience that a mislabeled jar opened in February can mean the difference between a pleasant supper and a wasted one. A sack of potatoes in the coolest corner, a few onions strung together and hung from a nail, their papery skins rustling faintly whenever the pantry door swings open. The pantry is in its own quiet way a second clock running alongside the visible one on the kitchen wall. Its shelves emptying and refilling on a rhythm dictated not by the hour, but by the season, by the harvest, by whatever arrangement your father has managed with a neighboring farmer or the corner grocer for this month's flour and sugar. You learn to read this rhythm the way you learn to read everything else in this house, not through explanation, but through simple, repeated observation. A shelf growing bare toward the end of winter means a certain caution creeping into your mother's meal planning. A shelf freshly stocked after the fall harvest means, for a few weeks at least, a slightly more generous hand with the butter, the sugar, the small extras that make an ordinary supper feel, briefly, like something closer to a treat. There is a particular corner of the kitchen near the door to the cellar stairs where the smell changes entirely from the rest of the room. Cooler, earthier, faintly mineral. The smell of the small root cellar below, where the heaviest and hardiest of the winter stores are kept, turnips and carrots bedded in damp sand, a barrel of apples wrapped individually in newspaper against the frost, a crock of something pickling in brine that will not be touched until the season turns. You are sent down those narrow wooden stairs more often than you would like a candle or a small electric torch in hand if the house has made that particular modern concession. And you learn quickly which steps creak and which do not. Learn to move quickly and purposefully in that cold, close dark, rather than lingering. Learn to bring back exactly what was asked for and nothing less. Because a second trip down those stairs on a winter evening is never something anyone volunteers for twice. The stove's presence in the room is felt long after supper itself has ended, its heat lingering into the evening in a slow, generous decline that the rest of the house can never quite match. Long after the fire has been banked for the night, the cast iron holds its warmth for hours, and it becomes without anyone deciding it should. The place where damp mittens are draped to dry, where a chilled child's socked feet find their way pressed flat against the oven door for a stolen minute of warmth, before bed, where bread dough covered with a clean cloth is left to rise overnight in the gentle residual heat, ready for the morning's baking before anyone else in the house has even opened their eyes. Baking day itself, whenever it falls in the week's rhythm, transforms the kitchen almost entirely, the air thickening with flour dust that catches the afternoon light in slow drifting motes, your mother's forearms dusted white to the elbow as she works the dough against the worn wooden board kept specifically for this purpose. You are given small tasks on these days, greasing pans with a knot of waxed paper dipped in lard, watching the loaves through the oven's small glass window with the particular patience of a child who understands that opening the door too early will collapse the whole careful effort. The smell of bread baking fills not just the kitchen, but drifts out through the porch door and down the front steps, announcing itself to the whole street. And there is a particular, wordless pride your mother carries on these afternoons, setting the finished loaves along the windowsill to cool their crusts, crackling faintly as they contract in the cooler air. A small daily miracle she has performed so many hundreds of times that she no longer thinks of it as remarkable at all, though it remains to you one of the most reliably comforting sights this kitchen ever offers. The particular clock on the wall above the pantry door deserves its own mention because its ticking becomes over years so constant a presence that you stop consciously hearing it at all, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat, except in the rare moments of true quiet, when its steady, patient rhythm suddenly reasserts itself into your awareness. Late at night, perhaps coming down for a glass of water, long after everyone else has gone to bed. The kitchen dark and unfamiliar in its stillness, that one small mechanical heartbeat. The only sound in the whole sleeping house. You have watched your father wind it every Sunday evening without fail. A small weekly ritual performed with the same unhurried care he gives to checking the stove's damper each night. One more small proof that this household runs, in every particular, on someone's quiet, unremarked attention. If you were to ask anyone who grew up in a kitchen like this one, what they remember most clearly, more often than not, after a moment's thought, they will not describe the stove, or the icebox, or even the room itself. They will describe the table, its particular shade of wood. The way one leg wobbled slightly if you leaned on it at just the wrong angle. The exact spot where their name was carved, faintly, secretly, one afternoon when no one was watching, and never fully sanded away no matter how many times their mother tried. The table in your kitchen is rectangular, built of solid pine or oak, depending on what your father or grandfather could source or afford when it was made or bought, and it has been extended once years ago, with a leaf that slides in from beneath and lifts the surface just slightly out of level, a fact everyone in the family knows and works around without ever mentioning it. It sits on 4 sturdy legs thick enough that you have more than once hidden beneath the table entirely during a game or during a moment when the kitchen felt too loud, too full of adult conversation, and found a strange dim safety down there among the legs and the underside of the surface, worn smooth in places, rougher in others, a hidden landscape known only to the smallest members of the household. The tablecloth changes, depending on the day and the occasion. On ordinary weeknights, it might not be there at all. Just the bare wood, wiped down after each meal with a damp cloth that leaves the surface faintly cool and slightly sticky in memory of whatever supper came before. On Sundays, and when company is expected, a cloth appears, often one your mother or grandmother embroidered herself over long winter evenings, years before you were born. Its edges scalloped, a faint pattern of flowers or vines, worked into the fabric in thread that has softened with each washing. You have watched her iron this cloth before laying it down, the particular care she takes with the corners, and you understand, even before you could explain why, that this cloth is not just fabric, it is evidence. It says, we are not careless people. We keep nice things, and we keep them properly, even in a house where money does not stretch as far as anyone would like. The table's position in the room is not accidental. It sits close enough to the stove that food can be carried the short distance while it is still hot, but far enough that no one gets scorched reaching past a pot. It sits beneath the single overhead light, so that in the evening, when the rest of the kitchen falls into shadow, the table remains illuminated. A small stage lit for the evening's central performance. Everything in the room seems to orbit it. The chairs pulled up close around its edges, worn in the seats from years of the same bodies settling into the same places night after night. A small unspoken geography that everyone in the family knows without ever having discussed it aloud. You have your seat. It has been your seat for as long as you can remember, and you would feel a small, strange unease if you were ever asked to sit anywhere else. Your father sits at the head nearest the door in the position that lets him see who comes and goes. Though in truth he rarely needs to see anything. He simply sits there because that is where the head of a household sits. A fact so deeply assumed that no one in the family has ever needed to say it out loud. Your mother sits nearest the stove in the chair that puts her closest to the pots, closest to the last-minute tasks of serving and refilling, a position that means she is often the last to properly sit, the last to properly eat her supper, interrupted a dozen times by someone needing more milk, more bread, more of whatever is running low. The wood of the table carries its own history, written in small physical marks that no one ever bothered to erase, because erasing them would have meant erasing the memories attached to them. There is a faint ring near one corner where a hot dish was set down without a trivet beneath it, years before you were born, and the shape of that ring has become over time less a blemish and more a landmark, the way you might say just past the ring when passing something across the table. There is a scratch running the length of one side where a toy truck was dragged too enthusiastically. One rainy afternoon, and if you ask about it, your mother's face softens in a particular way, remembering a child who was small once and who is not small anymore. And for a moment, the scratch becomes not a flaw in the wood, but a small, permanent piece of a person who has grown and changed and moved on in ways the table itself never will. This is in fact the quiet power of the table that you do not yet have words for, though you feel it every single evening you sit down at it. Unlike almost everything else in your changing life, your height, your friendships, the length of your hair, the games you play, the table does not change. It absorbs change. But it itself remains exactly where it has always been, exactly the shape it has always been. And there is something in that steadiness that settles you in a way you could not explain if asked, something that tells your body, even before your mind catches up, that whatever else has happened today, whatever scrape or disappointment or triumph the day has held, this is still the place where the day gets folded up and put safely away until morning. Meals here are not events scheduled around convenience. They are the fixed points around which the rest of the day organizes itself. Breakfast happens at a set hour because your father's shift, or the mill's whistle, or the school bell demands it. Supper happens at a set hour because your mother has planned the whole afternoon backward from that moment, peeling potatoes at 4, so they are ready to mash at 6. The entire rhythm of the household bending itself around this one recurring appointment at the table, day after day, season after season, with a regularity that feels from the inside of childhood less like routine and more like the very structure of time itself. And it is at this table, more than anywhere else in the house, that you will learn, slowly, unconsciously, through 1,000 small repetitions rather than any single lesson, who this family is. what it values, what it is willing to sacrifice for, and what it refuses to sacrifice under any circumstance, what it laughs about, and what it does not discuss. The table does not teach these things through speeches. It teaches them the way water shapes stone, through sheer, patient repetition, meal after meal, year after year, until the shape of the family is simply the shape the table has worn into all of you. Underneath the table, if you were ever small enough and curious enough to look, there is a crossbar running between the legs, worn smooth in one particular spot where feet, yours, your siblings, going back further than you can remember, have rested and swung and kicked idly through 1,000 meals. The wood there, paler than the rest, rubbed clean of its finish by nothing more than the ordinary restlessness of childhood. Your mother has scolded that swinging more times than either of you could count, the toe of a shoe catching a table leg, the whole surface shuddering slightly, a full glass wobbling dangerously near its edge. And yet the mark remains, a permanent record of exactly how many years of children have sat exactly here, waiting for supper, unable to keep their feet entirely still. There is a drawer too set into the table's own frame at one end holding the everyday cutlery. Handles worn smooth, a few mismatched from some set whose other pieces vanished years before you were born, replaced eventually by whatever could be found to fill the gap. You know the particular scrape of that drawer sliding open, the particular clatter of forks settling against spoons, and you know without ever having been told directly that setting the table correctly, cutlery in its proper place on either side of the plate, is one of the very first small competencies expected of you the moment you are judged old enough to be trusted with the task. There is a particular chair too, not yours, not anyone's exactly, though everyone understands its unspoken status, that sits slightly apart from the rest, brought in from another room whenever the family's numbers swell beyond the table's usual arrangement. It does not match. Its wood is a shade lighter, its back a different shape entirely, and whoever occupies it on a given evening understands, without ever being told, that they are in some small way a guest at their own family's table that night, a temporary addition to a seating arrangement that otherwise never changes. Younger children angle sometimes for the mismatched chair drawn by its novelty, and older ones quietly avoid it, having long since settled into the particular comfort of their own worn seat, the one shaped, however slightly, by years of exactly their own weight and posture. You come to know too the particular sound the table makes under different conditions. The low, steady creak when a heavy pot is set down at its center. The higher, sharper protest when someone leans too far back in their chair and catches the table's edge to steady themselves. The almost musical rattle of cutlery in the drawer when the whole table shifts slightly during an especially animated supper. These sounds become, over years of repetition, so familiar that you would recognize this exact table blindfolded, purely by the particular voice its wood and its joints make under the ordinary pressures of family life. Morning arrives at this table differently than evening does, with its own distinct choreography, its own particular urgency. There is no lingering at breakfast in this house, not on a weekday. The stove has already been going for the better part of an hour by the time you make your way downstairs, your mother having risen in the cold dark to coax the fire back to life from the previous night's embers, or in the households that have made the switch to click on the electric range and wait for its slow, steady warm-up while she measures out the porridge oats into a pot of water. You come down the stairs, pulling your sweater over your undershirt, the upstairs of the house having cooled considerably overnight, heat rising only weakly from the kitchen below through the floor, grates that pass for a heating system in half the houses on this street. The kitchen greets you the way it always does, a wall of contained warmth the moment you step off the last stair, and you move toward the table almost without deciding to drawn the way you are always drawn, pulling out your chair, the one that has always been yours, and sitting before you have even fully woken. Breakfast, in a house like this, is not a leisurely affair of choice and variety. It is fuel, dispensed with practical efficiency, the same handful of options rotating through the week, with only minor variation. Porridge most mornings, thick and grey-white in the pot, ladled into bowls with a modest spoonful of brown sugar, or a thin stream of molasses if the week has been kind, or plain, unadorned if it has not, Toast made on the stovetop or beneath the small internal broiler of the range, watched carefully because it burns in seconds if your attention wanders, spread with butter that has been carefully rationed across the family's needs for the week, sometimes stretched with a bit of lard when butter runs low. A substitution no one comments on because everyone already understands it without being told. Your father eats first, or nearly first, or at least is served first, his plate arriving at the table before anyone else's is fully ready. A small hierarchy built into the very rhythm of the meal that no one questions, because it has simply always been this way. He is, after all, the one whose day begins the earliest in most cases, whose shift at the mill or the plant or the shop demands he be out the door while the frost is still thick on the windows. And there is a practical logic beneath the hierarchy, even if the hierarchy itself carries meaning beyond the merely practical. He eats quickly, efficiently, his mind already halfway out the door and into the working day ahead. And there is rarely much conversation from him at this hour, beyond a grunted acknowledgement of the coffee, a brief comment on the weather glimpsed through the window, perhaps a short question to you about school, asked more from habit than from any expectation of a lengthy answer. Your mother, meanwhile, is in constant motion, pouring, refilling, buttering, wiping, and it will be years before you really notice that she is often the last one to sit, the last one to eat, and that by the time she finally does sit down with her own bowl, it has usually gone lukewarm, the porridge forming a faint skin across its surface that she eats anyway without comment, because commenting would imply that something about this arrangement deserves comment, and in her mind it does not. It is simply how mornings work. It is simply what a mother does. You eat your own breakfast under a set of unspoken rules so deeply absorbed that you could not list them if asked, though you would notice instantly if any one of them were broken. You do not reach across the table, you ask for things to be passed. You do not begin eating until everyone who is eating together has been served, unless you have been told otherwise. You do not leave the table until you are excused. A small ritual phrase, "May I be excused?" that must be spoken and answered before you are free to bolt from your chair and back up the stairs to finish dressing for school. You eat what is put in front of you because there is no alternative meal waiting in reserve if you decide you do not care for porridge this particular morning and complaining about food. In a house where food has been carefully budgeted and carefully prepared by a mother whose morning began an hour before yours, is simply not a thing that is done. There is a particular sound to these mornings that you will not fully appreciate until it is gone from your life. The specific clatter of a spoon against a ceramic bowl, the low murmur of the radio delivering the morning farm report, or the school closure announcements on the worst winter days, the creak of your father's chair as he pushes back from the table and reaches for his coat, the brief cold draft that sweeps through the kitchen each time the porch door opens and closes as he leaves for work, taking with him a small portion of the room's warmth and a larger portion of its watchful attention. After he leaves, something in the kitchen loosens slightly. Your mother's shoulders drop a fraction. The pace of the room, still busy, still full of tasks, becomes somehow less taut, and it is in this slightly looser morning air that you finish your own breakfast, gather your school things, and receive whatever final instructions the day requires. A reminder to wear your boots, a warning about the cold, sometimes a small kiss on the top of your head delivered so briskly you almost miss it, already halfway to the door yourself. And through all of this, morning after morning, the table sits beneath you, bearing the bowls and the spoons, and the brief business-like gathering of a family readying itself for a day of separate work, separate rooms, separate errands. A family that will not fully reconvene, will not fully become itself again, until it gathers back here at this same table when the light outside has turned that same blue-grey it wore the evening before, and the whole quiet cycle begins again. On Saturdays, this rhythm loosens just slightly, and you feel the difference the moment you wake. No urgency pressing down from the ceiling. No shift whistle waiting to be met. Breakfast on a Saturday might stretch a few minutes longer, might even include something a little out of the ordinary. A griddle of pancakes or fried eggs alongside the usual porridge. Your father lingering an extra few minutes over his coffee before the day's list of chores pulls him up and out toward the shed, the yard. Whatever repair or task the week has been saving for this one unhurried morning, The table on a Saturday carries a slightly different mood than it does on a Tuesday. The same wood, the same chairs, but a little more elbow room in the conversation, a little more room for a joke to land and be followed by another one. The whole week's accumulated tension loosening its grip for just these few unhurried hours before the work of the weekend, which is its own kind of work, begins in earnest. Sunday mornings carry their own distinct texture again, shaped this time by church rather than by rest. Breakfast is eaten a little more briskly than on Saturday, everyone dressed already, or dressing immediately after in clothes reserved specifically for this one morning of the week. And there is a particular tension in the air that has nothing to do with lateness for work and everything to do with the small familiar anxiety of being seen properly turned out by the whole watching congregation of neighbours and acquaintances who will measure, however unconsciously, this family's appearance against every other family filing into the same pews. The walk home from church, weather permitting, becomes its own small extension of the Sunday table. The whole family moving together down streets crowded with other families doing exactly the same thing. Hats and good coats catching the midday light. A slower, more sociable pace than any other walk the week permits, punctuated by brief exchanges with neighbours, also making their way home. Comparisons of the sermon of the weather, of whose garden is coming along fastest this spring, by the time you reach the porch door again. Appetite sharpened by the cold and the length of the walk. The Sunday roast that has been quietly cooking in your absence fills the whole house with its smell before the door is even fully open, and there is a particular anticipation to this specific homecoming that no ordinary weekday supper quite manages to produce. There is a particular hush that belongs only to the earliest minutes of a school day morning, before anyone else in the house is fully awake when you are for a few rare minutes, the only one at the table besides your mother. The radio has not yet been switched on. The rest of the family stirs somewhere above you. Footsteps crossing the ceiling. Water running briefly in the upstairs basin. In this small window of quiet, your mother sometimes says something to you she would never think to say once the kitchen fills with the ordinary noise of the full household. An offhand remark about her own girlhood. A brief, unguarded observation about the day ahead. A rare moment where the brisk efficiency of her usual morning self softens just slightly, addressed to you alone. You do not always understand at the time that these small unscheduled minutes are a gift, offered without ceremony, gone again the moment your father's footsteps reach the bottom of the stairs and the ordinary machinery of the morning resumes. Winter mornings carry their own particular ritual before breakfast even properly begins. The frost on the inside of the window pane thick enough some mornings to obscure the street entirely, and the small, private pleasure of scratching a clear patch through it with a fingernail to check on the state of the world outside, before anyone has told you what kind of day it will be. Your breath fogs the glass again almost as quickly as you clear it, and there is something almost ceremonial in this small daily ritual repeated by children in kitchens up and down the street. Each of you checking your own small circle of glass for snow, for sun, for whatever the day intends to bring. There are rules at this table that were never written down, never formally taught in any single sitting, and yet you know every one of them as certainly as you know your own name, because you learned them the way children learn almost everything essential. Through correction, through repetition, through the small sharp look your mother gives you across the table that requires no words at all to communicate exactly what has gone wrong. You sit up. Elbows stay off the surface, or at least they are meant to a rule enforced with varying degrees of strictness depending on the household and the particular evening, but present in nearly every home of this kind in some form or another. You do not speak with your mouth full. You wait until you have swallowed, and if you forget, a single raised eyebrow from across the table is usually enough correction to prevent a repeat offense for the rest of the meal. If not the rest of the week, you do not begin eating before grace in the households where grace is said. A brief familiar recitation spoken so many hundreds of times that the words have worn smooth and automatic, heads bowed for the few seconds it takes to give thanks for the food in front of you, a food that everyone at the table understands without it ever being stated outright, did not arrive easily. Even in households where no formal grace is spoken, there is often a beat, a pause, A moment where everyone waits for your father to pick up his fork before anyone else does an unspoken grace of its own. A small daily acknowledgement that this meal, like every meal, required someone's labor and someone's money and someone's careful planning to exist at all. Children speak when spoken to more often than not, particularly at supper, particularly when there are matters of adult concern being discussed. The cost of coal for the winter, a worry about your father's hours at the mill being cut, a piece of news about a neighbor that is not strictly speaking meant for young ears, but that gets discussed anyway in the lowered, careful tones adults use when they think children are not really listening. You learn quickly that you are always listening even when you appear to be entirely absorbed in your plate, and you learn just as quickly that the information gathered this way is not meant to be repeated, not to friends, not to teachers, not even sometimes back to the parent who said it, a silent contract of discretion that you enter into so young. You cannot remember a time before you understood it. You learn where you may and may not put your elbows, how to ask to be excused, how to hold your fork in the particular manner your mother insists upon, correcting your grip with a patient but firm hand whenever it slits back into whatever more comfortable, less proper position it wants to find. You learn that finishing what is on your plate is not merely encouraged but expected, a rule rooted less in any theory of nutrition than in a hard practical memory. Your parents' own childhoods or their parents' childhoods, marked by leaner years, by depression-era scarcity that has left its mark on an entire generation's relationship to food, so that a child leaving food on a plate registers in some deep, unspoken way as something closer to an offense than a preference. There is a particular tension that lives at this table between formality and warmth, and it is a tension you feel more than you understand, at least at this age. The rules are real, and they are enforced, and there is a genuine expectation of manners and discipline that runs through every meal. And yet within that structure there is also laughter, your father's rare dry jokes that land all the funnier for how infrequently he makes them, your mother's stories about her own childhood, embellished slightly more with each telling, your siblings' teasing that occasionally crosses a line and earns a sharp word from the head of the table, restoring order within seconds. The table holds both of these things at once, the discipline and the affection, without ever seeming to find them contradictory, because in this house, in this decade, they are not seen as contradictory at all. Discipline is, in its own way, a form of care. A rule enforced is a lesson given, and a lesson given is a small act of love, even if it does not always feel that way from the receiving end of a stern look across the table. You are also learning, though no one would ever describe it in these terms, a set of gendered expectations that shape the very geography of the meal. Your brothers, if you have brothers, are permitted to leave the table the moment the meal ends and their plate is cleared off, to whatever evening activity awaits them, while you, if you are a girl in this household, are expected to help clear, to help with the drying, to begin absorbing meal by meal the domestic labor that will one day be entirely yours to manage in a kitchen of your own. If you are a boy, you may be learning something different but no less binding, that certain tasks are simply not yours to do, that your role at this table, even as a child, is already being quietly shaped toward the role your father occupies at its head. A role of provision and presence rather than of preparation and service. None of this is spoken aloud as a lesson. It is simply the water you swim in, meal after meal, so consistent and so unremarked upon that it takes on the full weight of natural law rather than social custom. It will be years, decades in some cases, before you or your siblings begin to question any of it, before you begin to notice that the rules that shaped these suppers were never quite as natural, quite as inevitable as they felt from the vantage point of a child's chair at this particular table in this particular kitchen on all these particular evenings that blur together now into one long, warm, structured, sometimes stifling, always steadying memory of what a family was supposed to look like. There is a particular rule, too, about conversation itself. Not simply who may speak, but what may be spoken of, and how. Complaints about the food are not permitted, as you have already learned, but complaints about the day more broadly find a cautious welcome provided they are offered in the right tone at the right moment, and do not stretch on long enough to darken the whole meal. A scrapney, a disappointing mark on a spelling test, a friend's unkind word on the walk home from school. These are the small currency of a child's evening report delivered between bites, met with a measured sympathy from your mother, and if the matter seems serious enough, a brief practical word of advice from your father, who prefers solutions to sympathy and offers the former far more readily than the latter. You learn too the particular art of timing a request correctly, understanding without ever being taught explicitly that asking your father for anything of consequence works best after his plate has been cleared and his fork set down. Once the day's tiredness has softened slightly under the influence of a full stomach, rather than during the meal itself, when his attention is elsewhere and his patience worn thin by a long shift is not to be tested. This small calculation, performed instinctively by every child at this table, is itself a kind of education in reading a room, in understanding that even within a family bound by love, timing and tact still matter, still shape whether a request lands well or badly. You learn too a whole silent vocabulary of glances that passes between your parents across the width of the table, a language you are not meant to fully decode but absorb anyway, piece by piece, over years of careful watching. A particular look from your mother to your father when a comment has gone too far. A brief, almost imperceptible nod from your father that ends a conversation before it has properly begun. You come to understand that a marriage, at least the kind lived out at this table, runs on 1,000 of these small, unspoken exchanges, communications. So economical, so refined by years of practice, but an outsider seated at this same table might miss them entirely, might see only two people passing the potatoes, never guessing at the whole quiet negotiation that has just taken place in the space of a single glance. There is a particular rule, rarely broken and never explained, about interrupting. You wait for a natural pause, for a breath taken between sentences, and you learn to recognize the difference between a pause that invites you in and a pause that is simply your father gathering his next thought, a distinction that takes years of careful, sometimes painful trial and error to master. Interrupting your father mid-sentence earns a look sharp enough to end the attempt instantly. Interrupting your mother mid-task, mid-story earns something gentler, a raised finger, a just a moment that asks you to hold your thought exactly as it is until she is free to receive it, and you learn slowly the particular discipline of holding an urgent 7-year-old thought in your chest for the full length of just a moment, carrying it carefully until you are finally permitted to set it down. Money is never discussed at this table, not directly. Not in the plain, blunt terms you might expect from a household that is, by any objective measure, watching every dollar with considerable care. And yet money is present at every single meal, woven so thoroughly into the fabric of what appears on the table and what does not, that it becomes, in its own way, the most constant topic of conversation this family never has out loud. You notice it first, perhaps, in the particular rhythm of the week, a rhythm your mother has built with the precision of an engineer, though she would never describe it in those terms. Certain meals belong to certain days, not from tradition alone, but from careful calculation. A larger cut of meat on Sunday, when the week's grocery money is at its fullest, stretched deliberately to reappear in smaller forms across the days that follow, sliced thin for Monday's sandwiches, diced into Tuesday's stew, its bones simmered into Wednesday's soup, so that a single roast purchased once manages to anchor nearly half the week's suppers before it is finally entirely used up. This is not seen as deprivation. It is seen and spoken of, when it is spoken of at all, as skill. A woman who can make one roast last 4 meals is not a woman who is struggling. She is a woman who knows what she is doing, and there is real pride bound up in that knowledge. Pride that shows itself in the particular satisfaction on your mother's face when she sets down a meal that has, in fact, been carefully and invisibly stretched. You learn to recognize the signs of a leaner week without ever being told the week is lean. The butter grows thinner on the toast. The meat portions shrink, just slightly. Just enough that a growing child notices, even if they could not articulate the exact difference in ounces. Beans and potatoes appear more frequently, dressed up with whatever seasoning and presentation your mother can manage to keep them from feeling like the economy measure they actually are. A treat that might have appeared on a Friday, a small dessert, a special cut of meat, quietly does not appear and no explanation is offered, because offering an explanation would require naming the thing that is happening. And naming it is precisely what this family, like most families of its kind in the era, is determined not to do. There's a particular kind of pride at work here, layered and complicated, that took root in the hard years before you were born and never fully loosened its grip, even as circumstances improved. To need help is a private shame, something managed quietly, if it must be managed at all, rather than something spoken of even to close neighbours. Your mother would sooner serve the same modest supper 5 nights running than admit out loud to a friend on the telephone or across the fence that the budget this month has been tight. The performance of comfortable sufficiency, even when sufficiency is, in fact, a careful daily negotiation, matters almost as much as the sufficiency itself. And yet, within this careful economy, there are lines that are simply never crossed. Expenditures considered so essential to the family's dignity that they persist even in the leanest weeks. The tablecloth still gets ironed for Sunday, regardless of what sits beneath it. The good dishes, the ones reserved for company, still come out when company is expected, even if the meal served upon them is more modest than the dishes themselves might suggest. There is always enough for a visitor to be offered something, tea at minimum, and something to go with it, because to have nothing to offer a guest would represent a far deeper failure than any private tightening of the family's own weekday meals. You begin to understand, slowly, that thrift in this household is not merely about scarcity. It is a whole philosophy, almost a form of moral character, practiced with genuine skill and something close to artistry. Nothing is wasted. The heel of the bread loaf becomes bread crumbs or pudding rather than being discarded. Vegetable peelings and bones go into a stock pot rather than the bin. Jars are saved, stringies saved. Brown paper wrapping from parcels is smooth, flat, and folded away for reuse. Your mother's ability to produce a full, satisfying meal from what looks to an untrained eye like very little at all is a skill she takes real quiet satisfaction in, and it is a skill she is, in her own way, determined to pass on to you, correcting your own wastefulness with a small, sharp word. Whenever you leave too much on your plate, whenever you tear off more paper than the task requires, whenever you fail to appreciate that abundance in this household is not assumed, it is built, meal by careful meal, at this very table. There is a memory that will stay with you long after you have grown and left this kitchen behind. An evening when the grocery money ran short before the week's end, when your mother served a supper of little more than fried potatoes and bread, and yet somehow made the evening feel through sheer force of warmth and normalcy entirely unremarkable. No apology was offered, no explanation given. The meal was served with the same steady confidence as any other, eaten with the same conversation, the same small jokes from your father, the same insistence on manners and grace before the first bite. It was only years later, once you understood a little more about what a household budget actually required, that you looked back on that particular evening and recognized it for what it had been. Not an ordinary supper at all, but a careful, dignified performance of ordinariness, staged by a woman determined that her children would never once feel at her table the particular anxiety that she herself was quietly carrying. The grocery list itself, kept on a small scrap of paper by the sugar tin, is its own quiet document of this careful economy, written and rewritten across the week as your mother tracks what remains in the pantry against what the coming days will require. She does not simply write down what she wants, she calculates. Flour against the week's planned baking, a pound of ground meat stretched 2 different ways across 2 different suppers, a modest allowance set aside for whatever small treat the week's remaining coins might permit, usually nothing more than a bag of hard candy or a bar of chocolate to be divided carefully among however many children are waiting for it. You have watched her stand at the counter with this list and a small stub of pencil, murmuring numbers to herself, crossing one item off in favor of another, a private arithmetic that governs the entire week's meals long before a single potato has been peeled. The corner grocer knows this arithmetic too in his own way, and there is a particular relationship between him and your mother, built across years of regular visits, that allows for a small, unspoken flexibility the larger stores downtown would never offer. A bill run on credit until payday, settled without a word of judgment on either side. A slightly bruised piece of fruit, set aside at a reduced price rather than thrown out, offered to your mother with the same quiet discretion she extends to her own family's leaner weeks. This is its own kind of community economy, built on trust and long acquaintance, operating just beneath the surface of the town's more formal transactions. And it is one more thread in the invisible net that keeps a family like yours steady, even when the numbers on their own might not quite add up. There is a particular tin kept on the top shelf of the pantry, where small hands cannot easily reach it, that holds whatever coins the week has managed to spare, not savings in any grand sense. Nothing that would ever be described using so formal a word, but a modest growing accumulation set aside against whatever the coming months might demand. A winter coat outgrown too soon, a pair of boots that can no longer be resoled. You have seen your mother count this tin's contents on rare occasions, her lips moving silently as she works through the figures, and you understand watching her that this small tin represents a kind of quiet vigilance that never fully switches off a background calculation running beneath every single day of her life, invisible to almost everyone but present in nearly everything she does. There is pride, too, in the specific arithmetic of a well-run household, a pride that surfaces only rarely and only in particular company. A comment traded between your mother and a trusted neighbor about how far a dollar can be made to stretch if a woman puts her mind to it. An exchange of small practical wisdom. A recipe for making do that passes between women almost like currency itself. Valuable precisely because it cannot be bought. You listen to these exchanges without fully understanding them at the time, filing them away, regardless the way you file away nearly everything said at this table, certain that some of it eventually will turn out to matter more than you could have guessed while it was simply the ordinary murmur of adult conversation happening somewhere just above your head. If the table is the emotional center of the household, your mother is its engine, and it is only as you grow older that you begin to fully register just how constant, how relentless her motion around this room actually is. From the moment she rises well before the rest of the house stirs, to the moment she finally sits, briefly and completely, after the last dish has been dried and put away, she is rarely still, and her stillness, when it does come, is so unusual that it registers almost as an event in itself. Watch her, if you can, across the arc of a single ordinary evening. She begins the supper preparations hours before the meal itself, timing the peeling of potatoes, the trimming of whatever cut of meat the week's budget has allowed, against the return of your father from his shift, against the end of your own school day, against a dozen other small deadlines that only she is keeping track of. She moves between stove and sink and pantry shelf in a pattern so practiced it has become almost a kind of dance, though no one in the family would ever think to describe it in such generous terms. Least of all her. She serves your father first, or nearly first. She serves you and your siblings, ensuring each plate is adequate before her own concerns are addressed. She remains alert throughout the meal to the small signals of need around the table. A milk glass running low, a request for more bread, a younger child's fork abandoned in favor of fingers, requiring a quiet correction. And she rises to meet each of these needs as they arise, her own plate growing cooler with each interruption until, by the time she finally sits long enough to eat a proper portion of her own supper, the meal has often gone lukewarm and she eats it that way without comment, because commenting has never once occurred to her as an option. This labor is in the fullest sense invisible, not because it cannot be seen, but because it is so constant, so assumed, so woven into the very definition of what a mother is in this decade, that no one around the table, including your mother herself, thinks to name it as labor at all. It is simply what happens. It is simply supper arriving on the table each evening as though by some natural process, the enormous quantity of planning, budgeting, shopping, preparing, serving and cleaning that produced it entirely absorbed into the background of the family's awareness, the way you might absorb the fact of gravity without ever once in an ordinary day consciously registering its presence. Your father's role at this same table is entirely different in shape, though it too follows a pattern so deeply assumed that no one in the household would think to question it. He arrives, he is served, he eats, and his presence itself. His simple sitting at the head of the table, his brief remarks on the day, his occasional dry joke is treated as sufficient contribution to the evening. He does not clear his own plate. This is not laziness on his part, not in the eyes of anyone at this table, but a plain fact of the household's division of labour, a division so total and so unremarked upon that it would not occur to your father to clear his own plate any more than it would occur to him to knit a sweater. He has earned the money that bought the food on that plate through hours of hard, often physically punishing labour at the mill or the plant or the shop, and in the accounting of this household, that earning constitutes his full and complete contribution to the meal. You will notice, though you will not fully understand what you are noticing until you are older, that your father's tiredness is visible and acknowledged in a way your mother's never quite is. When he sits down heavily in his chair, when he rubs at his shoulder or his lower back, the whole table registers it. A quietness falls, a deference, an unspoken agreement that he has earned his rest and should not be troubled unnecessarily this evening. Your mother's tiredness, meanwhile, though arguably just as real, just as physically demanding expressed through hours on her feet rather than hours at a machine, goes largely unremarked, partly because she herself works hard to keep it unremarked, brushing off any inquiry into her own well-being with a brisk change of subject. A redirection back toward whoever else at the table might need something. There is real tenderness in this arrangement, even within its inequality. You should not mistake the shape of it for coldness. Your father's quiet pride in providing his particular way of complimenting a meal, not through words, but through a second helping taken without being asked, is its own form of love, understood perfectly by your mother, even though he would never think to phrase it that way himself. Your mother's constant motion around the table, her insistence that everyone else be served before she allows herself to sit, is its own form of love too, offered so consistently so without complaint, that its very invisibility becomes, in a strange way, its deepest expression, a love given so completely that it asks for nothing back, not even acknowledgement. And yet, if you watch closely enough on the right evening in the right light, you will catch something else too. A flicker of exhaustion crossing your mother's face as she finally sits down to her lukewarm plate, a moment where her shoulders drop just slightly further than usual, where her eyes rest on the middle distance for a second or two longer than the moment requires. It passes quickly. She catches herself, catches you watching, and offers a small smile, a brisk word about finishing your own plate before it gets cold. But you have seen it just for a moment. The weight beneath the warmth, the labour beneath the love, and though you cannot yet name what you have seen, some part of you will carry that flicker of exhaustion with you for the rest of your life. Bain, quiet understanding of everything this table has cost the person who has spent her whole day making sure it never runs empty. There is a moment most evenings once the last plate has been cleared and the leftover scraps set aside for tomorrow's use, when your mother finally allows herself to sit, not at the table itself most often, but in the chair nearest the stove, a cup of tea going lukewarm in her hands, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. This is the closest thing to rest her day permits. A brief interval before the evening's next round of tasks, the mending, the ironing, the lunches to be prepared for tomorrow, pulls her back up onto her feet. You have learned without ever being told not to interrupt this particular pause, to let her have these few quiet minutes uncontested, sensing even as a child that this small stillness is something she has earned many times over and asks for so rarely that it deserves, at the very least, to be left undisturbed. Your father's contribution to the household, though differently shaped from your mother's constant motion, carries its own quiet weight that you come to recognize only gradually. The particular stiffness in his walk by the week's end, the permanent faint stain of machine oil worked so deeply into the creases of his hands that no amount of washing before supper ever fully lifts it. He rarely speaks of the work itself, rarely complains. And it is precisely this silence, this stoic absorption of a day's physical toll without comment, that teaches you your own early understanding of what a man's labor is supposed to look like in this house, necessary, largely unspoken, carried alone. You will notice too the particular economy of praise that governs this table, so sparing that a single compliment, when it finally arrives, carries a weight entirely disproportionate to its brevity. Your father's "that was good." 3 words delivered without elaboration, his fork already being set down, is enough to visibly settle something in your mother's shoulders for the rest of the evening, enough that she will mention it in passing to a neighbor or a sister days later, still faintly pleased. Praise in this household is not withheld out of coldness. It is simply rationed the way everything else is rationed, deployed sparingly, so that it retains its value and you absorb without ever being taught it directly this same instinct, that saying too much too often cheapens the saying, and that the rarer a compliment somehow lands harder, means more than a dozen easy ones ever could. There are evenings too when the balance of the table tips, however briefly, in the other direction, when your mother, exhausted past her usual capacity for absorbing it quietly, allows a flicker of real frustration to surface, a sharper edge in her voice, as she asks, not quite rhetorically, whether anyone besides her intends to help clear the table tonight. These moments are rare enough that they register, when they happen, as a kind of small seismic event, everyone at the table sitting up a little straighter, chairs scraping back a little faster than usual, plates gathered with unusual efficiency. It passes quickly, the tension resolved within minutes. But you remember these evenings precisely because of their rarity. Small cracks in the otherwise seamless performance of endless, uncomplaining labor. Brief glimpses of the actual cost being paid beneath the surface of every other, more ordinary evening. There is a particular kind of tension that settles over the household on the days when company is expected, a tension that begins hours before the guests themselves ever arrive, and it lives more than anywhere else in the house, at the table. You feel it first in your mother's voice, which takes on a brisker, more focused edge from the moment breakfast dishes are cleared on such a day. There is a list in her head, unwritten but exhaustive. The good tablecloth needs pressing, the everyday chairs need a wipe down where sticky fingers have left their mark, the front step needs sweeping in case anyone glances at it on their way in, and the meal itself, already planned days in advance, needs to stretch just a little further than usual present, just a little better than usual, without ever appearing to have cost more than an ordinary supper would. This is the paradox at the heart of hosting in a household like yours. The meal must look effortless, must look as though such abundance and care are simply how this family eats every evening, while in fact representing a small, carefully managed departure from the ordinary economy of the week. The good dishes come down from the high shelf, where they live protected from daily use, wiped free of dust, arranged with a precision that the everyday plates never receive. The tablecloth your mother embroidered years ago, the one reserved for exactly these occasions, is smoothed across the table with visible care, its corners aligned, its slight fraying at one edge turned discreetly toward the wall, so it will not be the first thing a guest's eye finds. You are given your own instructions for these evenings, delivered in the brisk, slightly anxious tone your mother reserves for company days. Sit up straight, do not speak unless spoken to, particularly about anything that happened at school that might reflect poorly on the family. Do not ask for seconds in a way that suggests the portions were too small to begin with. Compliment the meal, if given the opening, but not so effusively that it suggests such a meal is unusual in this house. You absorb these instructions the way you absorb all the table's unwritten rules, not as a formal lesson, but as a kind of atmospheric pressure felt rather than explained, and you find yourself, without quite meaning to, performing a slightly straighter, slightly quieter version of yourself the moment the guests actually arrive and settle into their chairs. The conversation on these evenings follows its own careful choreography as well. Certain topics are safe. The weather, a shared acquaintance's recent good news, a mild complaint about the cost of coal that stays comfortably general rather than specific to your own family's particular circumstances. Certain topics are not safe at all. And you learn to recognize the small verbal sidesteps your parents perform whenever a conversation edges too close to one of them. A question about your father's hours at the mill deflected with a joke. A comment about a neighbor's new car met with a brief neutral nod rather than any real engagement, because engaging honestly might reveal either envy or a financial reality your parents have no interest in sharing across this particular table. And yet, beneath all this careful management, there is real warmth too, and you should not mistake the performance for insincerity. Your mother genuinely enjoys the company of the friends and relatives who sit at this table on these evenings. Your father, usually a man of few words at the family's ordinary weeknight suppers, often loosens considerably in the presence of a particular old friend, laughing more freely, telling a longer story than he would ever bother with on an ordinary Tuesday. The performance and the pleasure exist side by side, neither one cancelling out the other, and it is only much later, looking back with an adult's understanding, that you will recognize just how much quiet labor your mother poured into making these evenings look as effortless, as naturally abundant as they always seemed to you as a child sitting at your usual place, watching the good dishes catch the light of the overhead bulb. There is a particular kind of anxiety, too, that surfaces on these evenings around the question of what the guests will think, not simply of the meal, but of the household itself, its cleanliness, its order, its evident competence, a neighbour's passing glance toward a worn patch on the linoleum. A relative's comment, however innocently meant, about how the kitchen has not changed much since their last visit. These small moments land with a weight disproportionate to their size, because in a community where families are constantly silently measuring themselves against one another, the kitchen table becomes a kind of stage on which the household's standing is quietly assessed. Your mother feels this pressure more acutely than anyone else at the table, having done the vast majority of the labour that determines how the evening will be judged, and you begin to understand, watching her carefully manage the flow of conversation and the timing of each course, that hospitality in this house is not merely an act of generosity. It is also in its own quiet way a performance of dignity, proof offered without ever being stated outright that this family belongs, that this family is doing just fine. Thank you, regardless of whatever private tightening the week's budget might actually have required. By the time the guests have gone, the good dishes washed by hand and dried carefully before being returned to their high shelf, the special tablecloth folded and put away for its next occasion, something in the kitchen exhales. Your mother's shoulders drop the way they do most nights, only after your father has left for work in the morning. A release of a tension you had not fully registered as tension until you watch it leave her body. The table, its good cloth removed, returns to its ordinary bare wood, and there is in that return a small unspoken relief shared by the whole family, a sense that the performance is over, and the table can simply be a table again, holding nothing more than an ordinary family, and an ordinary supper, which it turns out after an evening of careful management and quiet anxiety, is precisely the thing everyone at this table actually preferred all along. Not every guest who sits at this table draws the same careful staging, and you learn over time to distinguish the different registers of company by the particular preparations that precede them. A visit from your mother's own sister requires almost none of the formal choreography reserved for your father's employer or a more distant relation. The good cloth might stay folded away entirely, the conversation looser, louder, punctuated by real laughter rather than careful diplomacy, your aunt's own children tumbling into the kitchen with a familiarity that makes the whole house feel for an evening comfortably crowded rather than carefully arranged. These are the evenings you secretly prefer, though you would never say so, sensing correctly that they represent something closer to the family's true, unguarded self than the more formal gatherings ever quite manage to reveal. The minister's occasional visit, by contrast, summons an entirely different level of preparation, one that exceeds even the standard company treatment, your mother's voice pitched a half-tone higher than usual, every surface in the house given a final anxious inspection before he arrives, your own manners drilled into near-military precision for the duration of his visit. You sense, without being able to name it, that this particular guest represents not simply a social judgment, but something closer to a moral one. His approval or quiet disapproval of the household carrying a weight that lingers in your mother's mind long after he has gone, replayed and second-guessed across the following days, in a way that a simple neighbor's visit never quite provokes. The preparations for company begin, in truth, long before the particular day itself arrives, a kind of low-grade readiness maintained across ordinary weeks, in case an unannounced visitor should happen to knock. The good soap stays in its dish by the sink, rather than in daily rotation. A tin of something slightly finer than the everyday biscuits is kept, discreetly, toward the back of the pantry, reserved for exactly this contingency, refreshed periodically so it is never caught stale, should the moment actually arrive. You come to understand that hospitality in this house is not simply reactive, summoned only once a guest is confirmed, but a kind of ongoing readiness woven quietly into the household's daily habits, a standing insurance against the small, particular shame of being caught unprepared. There is a specific choreography, too, to the moment a guest actually arrives at the door, your mother's brisk final instructions delivered in an urgent whisper as the knock sounds. The swift transformation of her own posture and voice the instant the door swings open, brisk anxiety, replaced almost instantly by warm, unhurried welcome. A transformation so complete and so practiced that you marvel even as a child at how thoroughly she manages to fold away every trace of the frantic preparation that came before presenting, instead, a woman for whom this visit, this particular afternoon, was always exactly what she had been looking forward to. There is a particular kind of company evening you come to treasure above the rest, though you would never have called it your favorite at the time. The unannounced kind, when an old friend of your father's simply appears at the door with no warning at all, and the whole household is thrown briefly into an entirely different mode than the carefully staged formal visit. There is no time for the good cloth, no time for the elaborate preparations, only your mother's quick, practical scramble to stretch the evening's ordinary supper, to accommodate one more chair, one more plate, managed with a kind of relaxed good humor that the formal occasions never quite permit. These evenings carry a looseness, an unrehearsed warmth that you come to recognize even young as somehow more honest than the carefully managed company evenings. A glimpse of hospitality practiced not as performance but simply as reflex, the table making room for one more without a second thought. Winter changes the shape of the evening in this house, and it changes, most of all, the way the family gathers at the table once the supper dishes have been cleared away. In the warmer months, there is somewhere else to be. The porch, the yard, a neighbor's step, the long blue dusk that seems to hold the day open for hours after supper has ended. But once the cold sets in properly, once the light begins failing before 5 and the wind starts working its way into every gap around the window frames, the kitchen table becomes something more than a place to eat. It becomes the anchor of the entire evening. You feel the cold before you see it. It presses against the window glass above the sink, and if you rest your hand flat against the pane after dark, you can feel the actual chill radiating off it, a physical presence in the room, even through the barrier of glass. Your mother has stuffed a rolled towel along the base of the porch door, where the draft finds its way in most persistently, and the whole kitchen holds a particular late evening quality in winter, warm at the center, near the stove cooling noticeably as you move toward the corners of the room, so that the table, positioned as it is, sits in a kind of temperate middle ground, warm enough to be comfortable, close enough to the stove's dying heat to stay that way through the hours of homework and quiet activity that follow supper. This is where you do your schoolwork more often than not. The supper dishes cleared and the table wiped down, your books and slate or scribbler spread across the same surface where the meal was eaten not half an hour before. Your mother works nearby, mending by the light of the same overhead bulb or preparing something for the next day. And there is a particular quality to these evenings that you will remember for the rest of your life, without being able to fully explain why. The specific hush of a winter night pressing against the windows, the low murmur of the radio in the background, the scratch of your pencil. the occasional creak of your father's chair as he reads the paper nearby. Everyone gathered in the same small circle of light and warmth, while the cold and the dark hold the rest of the world at bay just beyond the glass. The radio in these early years provides the family's shared evening entertainment, and there is a specific ritual to it. A particular program everyone has come to expect at a particular hour. Your father adjusting the dial with the careful patience the old set requires, the static resolving slowly into a clear signal as the whole family settles almost without deciding to back toward the table or the chairs nearest it. Drawn by the sound the way moths are drawn to a porch light, you listen to comedy programs that make your father laugh in a way he rarely does at any other point in the week, to serial dramas that your mother follows with genuine investment, asking after the next episode's events the following morning to whichever neighbor she happens to see first. It is a shared, communal listening, everyone receiving the same story at the same moment, in a way that already, even in this decade, feels like it is quietly changing. Because by the middle years of the decade, in more and more homes like this one, something new has arrived, and it changes the shape of the evening again, more dramatically than almost anything that has come before it. A television set appears, bought outright if the family can manage it, or purchased on the increasingly common installment plans that stores now offer, a small monthly payment stretched out across a year or more. A new kind of household debt that would have seemed almost unthinkable to your grandparents' generation, but that feels to your parents like simply the way modern life now works. The television's arrival reorganizes the entire evening around it in a way the radio, for all its popularity, never quite managed. Chairs get turned. The table, once the undisputed center of the room's attention after supper, now competes for that attention with a glowing rectangular screen in the corner. And you notice, though you would not have the words to describe it this way, a subtle shift in how the family occupies the kitchen in the hours after the meal. Homework still happens at the table, because the table is still where the light is best and the surface is still where books lie flat. But the after-supper lingering, the family sitting together simply to talk, to listen to the radio together, begins slowly to migrate toward wherever the television has been placed, whether that is a corner of the kitchen itself, or, in homes with the room to spare, into the parlor that had previously been reserved almost exclusively for company and for Sundays. Your mother watches this shift with a complicated mixture of feelings that she does not fully articulate, not even to herself. There is real pleasure in it, an evening's entertainment delivered right into the home, without the cost or the effort of an outing, a genuine novelty that delights her as much as it delights you and your siblings. But there is also underneath that pleasure a faint unease she cannot quite name. A sense that something about the shape of the evening, the shape of the family's togetherness, is shifting in a direction she has not entirely chosen and cannot entirely control. The conversations that used to happen at the table unhurried, filling the quiet hour before bed, now compete with the noise and the light of the screen, and there are nights when she finds herself almost without meaning to, calling everyone back to the table anyway, insisting on one more hand of cards, one more shared activity that does not involve simply watching, as though she senses, before anyone has quite named it, that something worth protecting is at stake in how these winter evenings get spent. Still, on the coldest nights, regardless of whether the evening ends at the table or in front of the new television, there is a particular comfort that belongs to this house and this season alone. The sound of wind finding every loose board and window frame outside, the deep settled warmth radiating from the stove, the knowledge absorbed so completely, you rarely think to be grateful for it, that whatever the weather is doing beyond the glass, this room, this family, this table will hold steady until morning. There are storms some winters, severe enough to close the school and keep your father home from his shift entirely, and these become, oddly, some of the warmest memories this table will ever hold. The ordinary week schedule dissolves entirely. Breakfast stretches long past its usual hour. Your father, unexpectedly present in the middle of a weekday, pulls his chair closer to the table than usual, and there is a loose, unstructured quality to these snowbound hours that the family rarely otherwise experiences. Cards dealt out across the table's surface, a jigsaw puzzle spread over one end of it for days at a stretch. Your mother baking something that requires no particular urgency, because for once there is nowhere else any of you need to be. You remember from one such storm the specific pleasure of watching snow pile against the kitchen window until it blocked nearly a third of the daylight, the whole room taking on a strange hushed underwater quality. Your father telling stories at the table that he never seemed to have time for. On an ordinary evening, your mother laughing at jokes she must have heard a dozen times before, but that seemed on this particular snowbound afternoon freshly funny all over again. These were not evenings anyone would have described, at the time, as special. They simply happened the way ordinary happiness so often does, without ceremony, without anyone remarking that this was a day worth remembering. And yet it is precisely these unremarked afternoons that surface first decades later. Whenever you try to recall what real contentment in that kitchen actually felt like, there is a particular smell that belongs only to these long winter evenings, one you will spend the rest of your life failing to fully name whenever you catch a distant echo of it somewhere else. Decades later, damp wool mittens drying on the rack behind the stove, the faint mineral tang of the coal scuttle by the door, a lingering trace of supper's onions folded beneath the sharper, cleaner smell of the soap your mother uses on the dishes, all of it held together by the dry contained warmth, radiating steadily from the stove's iron belly. You breathe this particular combination in without noticing you are doing so, the way you breathe in almost everything about these evenings without noticing, and it will not be until you are an adult, standing in some entirely different kitchen decades later, catching some faint fragment of this same combination by pure accident, that the whole evening, whole years of these evenings, will come rushing back to you with a force that has nothing to do with conscious memory at all. On the coldest nights, once the homework is done and the radio or the television has been switched off, there is a final small ritual that closes the evening before the walk upstairs to bed. The stove's damper checked and adjusted for the night, the ashpan given one last inspection, the porch door checked to be sure the latch is caught properly against the wind. Your father performs this small nightly inspection with the same unhurried thoroughness every single evening, moving through the kitchen in a slow final circuit before the lights go out, and there is something in watching him do this, something in the quiet practical care of it that tells you without a single word being spoken that this house and everyone in it is for tonight at least properly looked after. There is a particular texture to the silence of a house fully asleep in winter, one you come to know intimately during the rare occasions you find yourself awake long after everyone else, perhaps roused by a bad dream or simple restlessness, padding down the cold stairs in sock feet toward the kitchen for a glass of water. The stove sits banked and dim, its firebox glowing only faintly through the small grate, casting the barest orange suggestion of light across the linoleum. The table, empty of its usual bustle, takes on an entirely different character in this stillness. No longer a stage for the evening's performance, but simply a shape in the dark patient waiting for morning. And there is something faintly unsettling and faintly comforting at once in seeing it this way, stripped of all its daytime purpose, reduced to its simplest self, has four legs and a flat surface holding nothing at all. Every family that gathers at a table night after night, year after year, accumulates its own small history of embarrassments. Moments so minor in the larger scope of a life that they would barely register as memories at all, except that they happened here at this table in front of everyone who mattered most. And so they lodge themselves somewhere deep and stay there far longer than their actual significance would seem to warrant. You remember more clearly than you remember most of your childhood the evening you knocked over a full glass of milk, reaching too quickly for the bread plate, watching in a kind of slow-motion horror as it spread across the good tablecloth. Because it happened, of course, to be a Sunday, to be a night when the good cloth was down, when a relative or a neighbour happened to be seated across from you, and the sudden hush that fell over the table in that instant felt to your small self like the entire weight of the room's disapproval landing squarely and permanently on your shoulders. What you remember almost as clearly as the spill itself, though, is what happened next. Your mother's hands moving quickly without drama, blotting the cloth, murmuring something brisk and unbothered as she worked. the conversation resuming around you within a minute or two, as though the whole incident had barely registered at all. It was only later, once the guest had gone and the cloth had been soaked and the dishes had been dried, that a quieter word came your way. A reminder to be more careful delivered without real anger, more instructive than punishing, and you understood even at that young age that the sharpness you had braced yourself for had never actually been coming. The public moment had called for calm. The private moment allowed for correction. And somewhere in the space between those two responses, you learned something about how this family handled a small failure in front of others, swiftly, quietly, without shame heaped on top of the mistake itself. The lesson delivered later, gently. Gently, once the audience had gone. Not every household manages this balance so gracefully, and you know this because you have witnessed at other tables in other homes a sharper version of the same dynamic. A friend's father raising his voice over a spilled drink, a scolding delivered right there in front of company. The child's face going red and staying that way for the rest of the meal. You carry, without fully realizing you are carrying it, a quiet gratitude for the particular way your own table handles these moments, a gratitude that will not fully surface into conscious thought until you are an adult yourself, sitting at a table of your own, deciding in the split second after your own child knocks something over which version of a parent you are going to be. There are other embarrassments, two smaller ones, that live in the memory of this table. The evening you were caught mid-chew laughing at something your sibling whispered, and had to be sent briefly from the table to compose yourself before returning appropriately, sobered, to finish the meal. The time you announced with the blunt honesty only a young child possesses in front of a visiting aunt, that you did not care for the dish she had brought, and watched your mother's face perform a complicated, rapid transformation from horror to smoothing over grace in the space of about 2 seconds. Her hand finding your knee beneath the table in a small firm pressure that communicated more clearly than any words could have exactly how thoroughly you would be discussing this particular comment once the company had gone home. These small failures, these minor collisions between a child's undeveloped social instincts and the careful performance of a proper household, form their own kind of education, one that happens nowhere else in the house quite so intensively as it happens here at this table, under the watchful, loving, occasionally exasperated eyes of your parents. You learn what can be forgiven quickly and what requires a longer conversation. You learn the difference between an honest accident met with brisk practicality and a lapse in manners met with something closer to genuine correction. You learn too, though this takes longer to fully absorb, that the forgiveness always comes. However sharp the private word, however red your face has gone in the moment of the mistake, you are back at this table again, the very next evening in your same seat, forgiven and unremarkable once more. The whole incident already folding itself into the long, ongoing history the table quietly keeps of every small human failure that has ever occurred across its surface. There is a tenderness in this pattern that you will only fully appreciate much later in your life. The recognition that a family's love is measured not in the absence of these small conflicts, these embarrassments and corrections, but in how completely and how quickly they are absorbed back into the ordinary rhythm of the household. How thoroughly forgiveness is baked into the very structure of gathering here, night after night, regardless of what happened the evening before. There is one particular embarrassment that stands apart from the rest in memory, sharper and slower to fade than the ordinary spilled milk or ill-timed joke. An afternoon when you were sent at perhaps 7 or 8 to fetch something from the corner store and returned with the wrong item entirely, the coins you had been given not quite stretching to cover your mistake once you reached the counter, so that you came home not only without what your mother needed, but a few cents short of what you had left with. She said very little in the moment, but you remember the particular quiet at supper that evening, a quiet that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the plain arithmetic of a household where a few misspent cents were not a trivial matter, and you understood, with the sudden gravity children sometimes absorb all at once, that your small mistake had cost something real, something that could not simply be shrugged away with a brisk word and a wiped-down cloth. What softened that particular memory over time was not that the mistake stopped mattering, but that your mother never once let it curdle into something larger than it was. She corrected you firmly. And then this was the part that mattered most. She let it go entirely, never raising it again, never letting a single later evening supper carry the shadow of that afternoon's error. This too was a lesson delivered without a single word of explanation, for the household can hold its members accountable without holding a grudge against them. That correction and forgiveness are not opposites, but two halves of the very same act of care. There is a particular kind of shared embarrassment too that belongs not to any one child, but to the whole table at once. The evening the roast came out badly burnt on one side, blackened past any hope of rescue, and your mother, rather than apologizing or attempting some elaborate save, simply carved around the worst of it with brisk business-like efficiency and set the plate down as though nothing at all were amiss, daring with her posture alone anyone at the table to comment. No one did. You learned in that single unremarkable meal an entire philosophy about how a household absorbs its own small failures, not through denial exactly, but through a kind of collective wordless agreement not to dwell, an agreement that asked nothing of anyone except to pass the potatoes and let the moment pass along with them. You remembered too a particular evening when your father, usually so measured, so contained, laughed so suddenly and so completely at something your youngest sibling said that he very nearly choked on his own supper, coughing and laughing at once until his eyes streamed the whole table, dissolving into a helpless kind of laughter that fed on itself each fresh attempt to stop only setting someone else off again. These evenings are rare enough in a household built mostly on measured calm that they stand out sharply against the ordinary rhythm of things. Small eruptions of pure, unguarded joy that you carry with you long after the particular joke itself has been entirely forgotten, remembering not the words, but simply the shape of your father's face, helpless with laughter, at this same table where he was usually so quiet. The table does not remain the same table all year. It changes with the calendar marked and remarked by the particular rituals that each season brings. And it is through these seasonal transformations that you come to understand the table, not simply as furniture, but as something closer to a keeper of the family's whole shared memory, a surface that has held every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday of your entire childhood, all of them layered invisibly on top of one another in the same worn wood. Late summer brings the canning, and for several weeks the table disappears almost entirely beneath the work of it. Rows of glass jars catching the afternoon light, the particular sweet sharp smell of tomatoes or peaches or pickling brine filling the kitchen for days on end, your mother's hands, red and slightly swollen from the heat of the water bath, her focus narrowed to the single, urgent task of preserving as much of the season's abundance as the family's pantry shelves can possibly hold before the cold months arrive and fresh produce becomes once again a rare and costly thing. You are put to work too on these days snapping beans or peeling peaches, and the table becomes for this brief annual stretch less a place of gathering and more a place of shared purposeful labor, everyone's hands occupied toward the same essential goal. Autumn brings its own particular table, the surface cleared again for supper, but the meals themselves shifting toward the heartier fare. The season calls for thick stews and roasts that fill the kitchen with a deeper, richer warmth than the lighter meals of summer ever managed. And then, as the year turns toward its close, the table takes on perhaps its most significant seasonal identity of all, becoming the physical center of the holidays that anchor the entire family calendar. You remember these tables, plural, because they are never quite the same table twice, though they always look at first glance remarkably similar, extended with their hidden leaf to accommodate the full gathering of relatives who arrive for these occasions, the good cloth pressed and laid with a level of care that exceeds even the ordinary company Sunday standard, the good dishes brought down and arranged with real ceremony. There is a turkey when the family can manage one, or a large roast, if not surrounded by the particular constellation of side dishes that have become through years of repetition, simply what this family eats on this particular day. A dish of preserved vegetables from the very canning labor of late summer, now finally put to use. A pie made from an old recipe passed down through your mother's side of the family, its crust crimped in the exact pattern her own mother taught her, a pattern she is in turn quietly teaching to you, correcting the pressure of your fingers against the dough with the same patient repetition her mother once used on her. These holiday tables carry a different emotional weight than the ordinary weeknight table, though they are built from the very same wood surface that held last Tuesday's modest supper of potatoes and bread. There is more laughter here, more noise, more chairs squeezed in tighter than they are ever squeezed on an ordinary evening. A great-aunt's particular way of telling the same story every single year, met each time with the same indulgent, affectionate groan from everyone who has heard it a dozen times before, and will happily hear it a dozen times again. There is also beneath the celebration a quieter current of remembrance. An empty chair some years where a grandparent used to sit, a moment of hush that passes over the table when someone mentions a name that is no longer present to answer to it, the holiday meal becoming in these small pauses, a place where the family's grief and the family's joy sit down together at the very same table without either one cancelling out the other. Birthdays, too, leave their mark on this table across the years. Smaller occasions than the great holiday gatherings, but no less carefully tended. A cake appears made from whatever your mother's skill and the week's modest budget can manage, candles pressed into its surface and lit with a match struck against the side of the stove, the whole family gathered close. The overhead light dimmed for the brief theatrical moment of singing, before it is switched back on and the cake is cut and distributed. The youngest members of the family always insisting on licking the icing from the knife, despite years of being told this is not strictly speaking permitted. Across all of these occasions, ordinary and extraordinary alike, the table remains the one constant, absorbing each celebration into its surface, the same way it absorbs each ordinary Tuesday, so that by the time you are old enough to sit back and actually notice this pattern, you begin to understand something about the particular kind of history this table is quietly keeping, not the history written in books, not the history of elections or wars or great public events, but a smaller, denser, more intimate history made entirely of suppers and birthdays and holidays and ordinary Wednesday evenings, each one leaving its own faint, invisible mark on the same worn wood, until the table itself becomes in its own quiet way the single most complete record that exists anywhere of exactly who this family has been and exactly how they have loved one another across every season of every year you can remember. Spring, when it finally arrives, brings its own smaller rituals to the table, quieter than the great autumn feasts, but no less specific to their season. The first tender vegetables from a neighbour's early garden find their way onto the table weeks before your own family's plot has produced anything worth picking. Offered across the fence in a gesture of casual generosity that will be returned in kind later in the season once your own rows have caught up, Easter brings its own particular meal. Eggs coloured the evening before in a production that takes over one whole end of the table. Small hands working carefully with dye and vinegar under your mother's close supervision. The finished eggs set out in a bowl at the table centre the next morning like a small temporary decoration that will not survive the day's boiled egg breakfast. There is a particular satisfaction too in the way the table registers the very first meal made from the summer's new garden. A plate of the season's first peas or the first ripe tomato, sliced as simply and served with almost ceremonial pride, your mother watching the table's reaction with a hopefulness that has nothing to do with the dish's actual difficulty and everything to do with the long months of tending that preceded it, weeks of weeding and watering, finally arriving at this one modest, deeply satisfying plate. There is a particular quiet pride, too, that belongs to the table on the day the last jar of the previous summer's canning is finally opened and used sometime deep into the following spring. The shelf that once groaned under the weight of a full season's preserving, finally emptied of its very last contribution. Your mother marks this small milestone privately, rarely aloud, though you learn to recognize the particular satisfaction in her face when she reaches for that final jar, understanding, without being told, that an entire year's careful cycle, planting, tending, harvesting, preserving, and finally at last using, has come full circle exactly as it was meant to, just in time for the next season's planting to begin the whole quiet process over again. Thanksgiving, when it arrives, carries its own particular flavour, distinct even from the grander Christmas table still weeks away. A smaller, quieter gathering in most years, often just the immediate family, rather than the full crowded assembly of relatives. And there is something in this smaller scale that lets a different kind of gratitude surface, less performative, more plainly felt. Your father, who rarely speaks at length about anything, sometimes offers a longer grace on this particular evening than on any other night of the year. A handful of specific, unhurried sentences about the harvest, about the roof over your heads, about the particular good fortune of simply being gathered here together at this same table one more year running, and you sit with your head bowed a little longer than usual on these evenings, sensing even young that something slightly more serious than the ordinary nightly grace is being asked of the room. Before we go further, if this slow return to another decade is giving you the kind of quiet you were hoping for tonight, a like helps more than you'd think, and so does staying subscribed for the next one of these journeys. We're a small channel, and it's really your support evening after evening that keeps this kind of storytelling alive. There are evenings rarer than the ordinary suppers, but no less deeply etched into memory, when the table becomes something else again. Not a place of celebration, not a place of correction, but a place of quiet endurance. The physical center around which a family gathers when something has gone wrong. And there is for the moment very little to be done about it, except to sit together and wait it out. You remember an illness one winter, not your own but your father's, a bout of something serious enough to keep him from his shift for the better part of 2 weeks. Serious enough that the doctor was called, an expense that landed on the household with a weight you could feel even without being told the exact figure. The rhythm of the table changed entirely during those weeks. Your father's chair sat empty at its head some evenings, his supper carried instead on a tray to the bedroom where he lay recovering, and the remaining family gathered around a table that felt in his absence strangely unbalanced, as though the whole geometry of the room had shifted around the missing weight of him. Your mother's face during those weeks carried an expression you had not seen from her before, a tightness around her eyes that she tried and largely failed to fully hide. The particular strain of a woman managing a household's full daily labor, while also nursing a sick husband, and quietly calculating in the part of her mind she kept from the rest of the family exactly how many weeks the household savings could absorb before real trouble set in. And yet even during those weeks, supper still appeared at the table each evening, at the same hour, prepared with the same care, because the table's steadiness, you would come to understand, was not simply a comfort during ordinary times. It was, if anything, even more essential during the hard ones. A fixed point that did not waver even when everything around it felt uncertain. A daily proof offered without a single word of explanation that the family was still functioning, still holding together, still capable of sitting down at the appointed hour and eating a meal together, despite whatever fear was quietly circulating beneath the surface of the conversation. There is a particular kind of comfort that gets passed silently between family members at a table like this one during a hard stretch. A comfort that has almost nothing to do with words. A hand resting briefly on your shoulder as your mother passes behind your chair. An extra portion quietly served onto your plate without comment. A small unspoken message that you are cared for even in a week when care has to be rationed more carefully than usual. Your older siblings' uncharacteristic gentleness toward you during those weeks, a kindness that would embarrass both of you on an ordinary evening, but that in this particular stretch of worry passes without remark, simply absorbed into the general softening of the household's usual edges. You remember too the evening your father finally returned to the table, still visibly weakened, moving more slowly than usual as he lowered himself into his chair at the head, and the particular quality of the silence that fell over the table in that moment, not the tense silence of the illness itself, but something closer to relief, a held breath finally released. The whole family's collective anxiety of the past 2 weeks folding itself quietly away as the ordinary rhythm of the table reasserted itself. Plates past small talk resumed the specific comfort of an evening that felt, for the first time in weeks, genuinely ordinary again. You noticed something else too in the weeks that followed your father's recovery, something you would not have words for until much later. a particular gentleness that lingered at the table long after the illness itself had passed. Your mother's hand finding your father's shoulder more often than it once did, as she moved behind his chair. A small, unhurried pause in her constant motion that had not been there before, as though the fright of those 2 weeks had left behind alongside its worry. A quiet, renewed tenderness that neither of your parents would ever think to name aloud, but that you, watching closely as children do, could feel radiating from the table regardless. An extra warmth folded invisibly into the ordinary business of passing the potatoes. Bad news when it comes to this table tends to arrive the same way it arrives to most tables of this era and this place. Quietly delivered in low tones, often held back from the youngest members of the family until it can be managed, filtered, softened into something a child can absorb without being frightened by its full weight. You remember the evening a telegram arrived carrying news of a distant relative's passing, your parents' faces changing in a way you noticed immediately, even before you understood what had caused it. The supper that followed unfolding in a hushed, careful register, adult conversation kept low and edited, though you absorbed enough of it, as you always did, to understand that someone the family had loved was now gone, and that grief that evening had found its way to the very same table where birthdays were normally celebrated, where ordinary Tuesdays normally passed without event. What you learn from these harder evenings across the years is something you would struggle to articulate even now, though you feel its truth completely. That a table's real purpose is not simply to hold food, but to hold a family together through whatever the week happens to bring, good or difficult, ordinary or exceptional. The table does not change shape to accommodate hardship. It remains exactly what it has always been, exactly where it has always been. And it is precisely that unchanging steadiness, that refusal to acknowledge that anything about the room itself has shifted, even when everything about the family's circumstances has, that offers its own quiet, wordless reassurance. Whatever this week has cost you, the table will still be here tomorrow evening, and so, in all likelihood, will everyone gathered around it. There was another hard season, different in shape from your father's illness, but no less felt around this table, a year when the mill cut back its hours across the whole workforce. Your father's own shifts trimmed in a way that touched every household on the street at once, so that the particular private shame usually attached to hard times loosened its grip, somewhat softened by the shared, open knowledge that nearly everyone was managing some version of the same tightening. Supper during those months grew simpler by careful, deliberate degrees, and yet the table's rituals held firm regardless. The grace still said, the manners still enforced, the good cloth still pressed for Sunday, as though the family's discipline around the table's smaller rules became, if anything, more important, precisely because so much else felt uncertain, a steadiness deliberately maintained in the one place the family still had full control over. You remember from that same stretch of leaner months a particular evening when a neighbour appeared unannounced at the porch door, carrying a covered dish offered without much explanation beyond a brief practical remark about having made too much, an offering that everyone at the table understood, without a word being said. For exactly the quiet act of care it actually was. Your mother's face receiving it moved through a complicated sequence of pride and gratitude and something close to relief, and the dish was folded into that evening's supper, without further comment, though you noticed, watching her, the particular way she thanked the neighbour again unprompted the following week. A small act of reciprocal grace extended back across the fence in whatever quiet form the following season's abundance would eventually allow. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the table on the evening your father comes home to announce with the same measured, undramatic tone he uses for nearly everything that his hours are being restored. The mill's fortunes having turned some corner, none of you were fully aware it had been approaching. He does not make a great performance of the news. He simply says it between one bite and the next, and yet you watch it land around the table like something almost physical, your mother's shoulders dropping in a way you recognize from 100 other smaller reliefs. A lightness entering the room that has nothing to do with anything visible and everything to do with the invisible arithmetic that has been running beneath every meal for months. Supper that evening is no different in its actual contents from the supper the evening before, and yet it tastes somehow entirely different, seasoned by a relief no one quite names aloud. but everyone at the table clearly shares. There comes a point, gradual and then suddenly undeniable, when the table you have known your entire childhood begins slowly to change shape. Not in its physical construction, which remains exactly as it has always been. The same amber wood, the same faint ring near one corner, the same wobble in the leg if you lean on it just wrong, but in its population, in the particular configuration of who actually sits around it on any given evening. The first change is small enough that you barely register it as a change at all. An older sibling takes a job that keeps them out past the usual supper hour some evenings in their chair for the first time in your memory. Sits empty at a meal that would once have been unthinkable without them present. Your mother sets a plate aside for them anyway, covered with another plate to keep it warm waiting on the back of the stove. For whenever they finally do come home, and there is something in this small accommodation, the family's rhythm bending however slightly to make room for a member who is beginning in some small way to step outside its boundaries, that marks, though none of you would think to name it this way at the time, the very first thread of a much larger unraveling still years away. That unraveling comes gradually, the way most real changes do. Each individual step small enough to absorb without much disruption, the cumulative effect only becoming visible if you allow yourself to look back across several years at once. An older sibling marries and moves into a home of their own. Their chair now empty not just on occasional evenings but permanently filled instead on the holidays when they return by a new spouse who must learn, awkwardly at first, the table's particular unwritten rules. Where to sit, when to speak, how to navigate, the specific choreography that the rest of you absorbed so long ago you no longer remember learning it at all. Another sibling leaves for further schooling in a city some distance away. Their letters home read aloud at the table on the evenings they arrive, your mother's voice catching very slightly on certain lines, though she covers it quickly, the way she has always covered every difficult feeling that has ever surfaced at this particular table. You yourself in time begin to notice your own increasing absences from this table you have occupied every single evening of your entire remembered life. An evening job, a courtship, a widening circle of your own that begins, slowly and then not so slowly, to pull you outward from the exact center of gravity this kitchen has always represented. There is a particular ache in this that you do not expect a strange grief attached not to anything bad happening, but simply to the ordinary, inevitable fact of growing up, of a childhood table gradually loosening its hold on you, even as you understand in some deeper way that this loosening is exactly what is supposed to happen, exactly what your parents themselves have been quietly preparing you for, across every one of those thousands of ordinary suppers, teaching you the manners and the rules and the values that would one day carry you out into a life and a table entirely your own. Your parents feel this shift too, though they navigate it with the same careful restraint that has always characterized their handling of difficult feelings within these walls. There are evenings once the last of the children have finally gone when you return to visit and find your mother and father sitting together at a table built for 5 or 6, occupying just 2 of its chairs, the rest pushed neatly against the wall or folded away entirely. The sheer size of the surface now almost comically disproportionate to the small quiet meal shared between 2 people who once filled every single seat around it. Your mother on one such visit catches you looking at the empty chairs and offers a small rueful smile. A brief acknowledgement, rare for her, of a feeling this directly named, that the house does feel quieter than it used to, though she follows it quickly with a brisker comment about how nice it is really to finally have a little peace. After all these years, the 2 truths, the loss and the relief, sitting comfortably enough together at this same table that has held every other contradiction the family has ever carried, and yet, even in this quieter, emptier configuration, the table's essential character does not change when you do return. For a holiday, for an ordinary Sunday visit, for no reason at all beyond simply wanting to sit in your mother's kitchen again for an afternoon, the table receives you exactly as it always has, your old chair still somehow feeling like yours, even after years away, the particular geography of where everyone sits reasserting itself, almost automatically the moment enough of the family has gathered back around it. Nieces and nephews arrive eventually, filling chairs that once held your own smaller self, learning the very same unwritten rules you once learned, sitting up straighter under your mother's watchful eye, the exact way you once did. And there is something in watching this quiet repetition, this table's steady capacity to absorb a whole new generation into its same worn rhythms, that offers a comfort deeper than almost anything else you have known. The recognition that while every individual who has ever sat at this table will eventually grow up and move on and change the table itself, and the particular kind of love it has always represented somehow manages to carry on, regardless, passed quietly forward from one generation's hands to the next. There comes, too, a particular evening. You could not say exactly which one, because it does not announce itself as significant while it is happening, when you notice that you yourself have become, without quite meaning to, the one doing for someone else what your mother once did for you. Perhaps it is a younger cousin's child seated at this same table for a holiday, elbows drifting toward the surface, and you find the correcting word rising in you almost before you have decided to say it. The exact cadence of your own mother's voice emerging from your own mouth, familiar and slightly startling all at once. You catch yourself in that moment understanding something about how thoroughly this table has shaped you, how completely its rules have become. Not rules at all anymore, but simply the shape of your own instincts passed down and now quietly being passed onward again. Your own visits home, as the years accumulate, begin to carry their own small rituals distinct from the ones you grew up with. A particular chair you now gravitate toward, that is not quite your childhood seat, but sits close enough to it that the difference barely registers. A habit of arriving slightly early specifically to catch those same quiet, unscheduled minutes with your mother, before the rest of the gathering fills the kitchen, minutes that mean more to you now, as an adult who understands what they cost her to offer than they ever did as a child, simply receiving them without a second thought. There will come an evening many years from the one where we began tonight, when you find yourself back in this kitchen, or one very much like it, standing in a doorway rather than sitting at the table itself, simply looking. The stove may have changed by then, the icebox certainly will have. The calendar on the wall will mark a year your younger self could never have quite imagined. But the table, if you are fortunate enough to have kept it, or one very much like it if you have not, will still hold the same essential shape it has always held. A rectangle of worn wood, a scattering of mismatched chairs, a surface that has absorbed across all these years more of your family's real history than any photograph or letter ever managed to capture. You will think, on an evening like that, of everything this table quietly witnessed and never once commented on. The 1,000 ordinary suppers, indistinguishable from one another in memory, except for the general warmth they all shared, the company evenings, carefully staged, the good cloth pressed and laid with such deliberate care. The spilled milk, the scolding delivered gently, and only once the guests had gone. The holiday tables extended with their hidden leaf, crowded with relatives, some of whom are no longer here to fill their old chairs. The hard weeks, the illness, the low-voiced bad news delivered and absorbed, and somehow, always, survived. The slow emptying, chair by chair, as children became adults and adults became visitors, the table shrinking in its daily use even as it remained, in memory, exactly as full as it had ever been. You will think of your mother's hands, moving constantly around this room for years on end, serving everyone else before finally, briefly, sitting to eat her own cooling supper. You will think of your father's particular silence at the head of the table, a silence that said more, somehow, than most people's words ever managed to say. You will think of your own younger self, small enough once to hide beneath this very table during some long-forgotten game, looking up at its underside at a landscape of worn wood and old nail heads that felt, from down there, like its own private secret world. What this table taught you, across all those years, was never delivered as a formal lesson. No one ever sat you down, at this table or anywhere else, to explain what family actually meant, what love actually looked like, when it was mostly unspoken, mostly expressed through the quiet, relentless labor of getting supper onto the table at the same hour every single evening, regardless of what the week had cost. You simply absorbed it meal after meal, year after year, the way you absorb almost everything that matters most, not through explanation, but through sheer patient repetition, until the shape of that love became simply the shape of your own understanding of what a family is supposed to be. Perhaps this is why a table like this one, plain as it is, ordinary as it is, holds such a particular power over memory. It asks for nothing spectacular. It does not appear in any history book, does not mark any date anyone outside the family would think to remember. And yet it holds within its worn and imperfect surface the entire emotional architecture of an ordinary life. The discipline and the tenderness, the thrift and the quiet pride, the hierarchy and the deep, wordless devotion that ran beneath it, the small embarrassments, forgiven by morning, the hard weeks endured together, the seasons turning and turning again around the same steady wood. If you grew up around a table like this one, in a kitchen like this one, in a decade like this one, perhaps something in tonight's journey has settled quietly into a place you did not expect it to reach. And if you did not, if your own childhood table looked entirely different, sat in an entirely different kind of kitchen, in an entirely different country or decade, perhaps you recognize something else instead. The universal shape beneath the specific details, the simple enduring truth that a family wherever and whenever it exists tends to gather around something. A table, a fire, a particular room that holds the day's ending and the next day's beginning, night after night. For as long as that family remains a family at all, there is one last thing worth sitting with, before we let this particular kitchen fade back into the past where it belongs. It is this: none of the people who gathered around that table on any of those thousands of ordinary evenings ever once thought of themselves as living inside something that would one day be remembered this carefully, this tenderly, by anyone at all. Your mother, moving between stove and sink and table, was not performing for memory. She was simply getting supper on. Your father, settling heavily into his chair at the head of the table, was not aware that the particular weight of his silence would one day feel to a grown child, decades later, like one of the most eloquent things he ever offered. This is perhaps the quiet mercy of ordinary life, that it does not know it is being lived inside a memory in the making, and so it simply proceeds unself-conscious, plain entirely itself. And it is precisely that plainness, that total lack of performance, that makes it later so unbearably precious to look back on. Perhaps that is worth carrying with you tonight, wherever your own table happens to be, however different it looks from the one we have just spent these hours inside together. Perhaps it looks nothing like this one at all. Glass and steel instead of amber wood, a screen glowing somewhere nearby instead of a radio's low murmur, take-out containers instead of a row stretched carefully across 4 separate suppers, and perhaps still something in it rhymes with what we have described tonight. A particular chair that is somehow always yours, a particular hour when the people who matter most to you find their way, however briefly, back to the same surface, the same small circle of light. Whatever ordinary evening you return to tomorrow, the supper that seems unremarkable, the conversation that feels like nothing more than the usual small exchange of a usual small exchange of a usual small day, some part of it, you can be fairly certain, is quietly becoming exactly this kind of memory, even now unnoticed, unremarked upon, simply happening the way all the best and most lasting things in a life so often do. You will not know tomorrow evening which small ordinary moment is the one you will find yourself returning to, decades from now. This is perhaps the whole quiet point of it. You are never told in advance which supper will turn out to matter most. We simply sit down, again and again, and let the ordinary evening do what it has always done. Let this be where we leave things tonight. The dishes are dried and put away. The good cloth, if it was out at all this evening, has been folded and returned to its drawer. The kitchen light dims, and beyond the window, wherever you are tonight, the world outside continues on in its own quiet way, indifferent to this small return we have just made together, into another time, another table, another family's ordinary, extraordinary evening. Thank you for spending these slow hours here with me tonight. If this kind of quiet return to the past is something you would welcome again, remember that a like and a subscription are what let this small channel keep making these journeys, and I would love to know whenever you feel like sharing where in the world you settled in to listen tonight. Rest well, sleep deeply, and when you are ready, we will find another ordinary evening in another ordinary kitchen and settle in together once again. Good night.